Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Venkat Narayan. He's a professor, part of the Faculty of Global Health, jointly appointed to epidemiology at Emory University. He's also the Ruth and O.C. Hubert Chair in Global Health. That's more the complete name. We're going to talk about diabetes and digestive and kidney diseases. So, Venkat, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, tell me about your research. What are you working on?
Yeah, basically, I've focused my research for the past 30 years on diabetes, type 2 diabetes, working at various settings, initially at the NIH, where I was an intramural scholar with the Pima Indian study, and then at CDC, where I headed the diabetes branch for 10 years, and now at Emory University, where I direct the Emory Global Diabetes Research Center. And a lot of our research is focused on understanding the epidemiology of type 2 diabetes in the US and globally, trying to figure out the causes of diabetes and its pathophysiology, and testing interventions for prevention of diabetes and for improvements in quality of care for people with diabetes, and also examining a variety of health policy scenarios. So our work is very global. Although we work a lot in the United States, our work is extremely global, and we work in several countries of the world. And essentially, it reflects the idea that diabetes today is a global pandemic. It already affects about 435 million people worldwide and is expected to affect another 200 million more within the next 20 years. So it's a major disease in several parts of the world, particularly in the low and middle income countries.
Yeah, in terms of the physiology of type 2 diabetes, what are some of the misconceptions you see out there? And what's like the really important reality that people need to understand about it?
A number of things. I mean, a lot of our modern understanding of diabetes really started with the study called the Pima Indian study in Arizona. The Pima Indians are a Native American tribe who are believed to have migrated somewhere from Central Asia about 35,000 years ago and wandered their way into the Americas. And a group of them, after migrated back from South America and settled near the banks of the Gila River near Phoenix, Arizona. And that population had a very steady lifestyle for centuries, for many, many centuries, until the early 1960s, when an NIH survey discovered that 50% of the population had type 2 diabetes, what we today call type 2 diabetes, before the age of 45. And what was intriguing was there had not been much diabetes in that population until the 1920s and 30s. So somewhere in that 30-year period, there seems to have been an explosion of type 2 diabetes in that population. And a lot of it was driven by the loss of their agriculture because the building of the Roosevelt Dam, loss of the agriculture, sudden changes to their lifestyle, etc. So from that population, the idea of the pathophysiology of diabetes that emerged was that a large part of diabetes was being caused because of obesity, and that obesity would induce insulin resistance. In other words, would impair the action of insulin, which is the hormone that regulates blood glucose. And that is a very valid and important theory and applies to a very large degree. But of late, we are beginning to find that the primary problem might actually be more to do with poor insulin secretion, particularly in populations which are now suddenly developing diabetes, type 2 diabetes in low and middle income countries. So we think the primary problem in diabetes might be poor insulin secretion, and overlay onto that adiposity and insulin resistance, and the speed of development of diabetes is very rapid. So that's one important distinction to make.
What do you mean the ease or the ability or the flow of insulin secretion? What would hamper it, for instance?
Okay, that's a very good question. So there are a number of possibilities. One could be because, particularly in populations that have had centuries of undernutrition, perhaps a possibility is because of nutritional deficiency or other factors, various organs have been compromised. And one of the organs compromised might also be the pancreas and the beta cells of the pancreas, which are very sensitive little organs. So that could be a more innate kind of thing. It could be genetics. It could be damage to the beta cells of the pancreas during intrauterine life, because of poor nutrition or because of toxins. Those are the possibilities. In the case of type 1 diabetes, it could be because of an autoimmune process. So all of those things might be a problem. So we think poor insulin secretion to start with might be the starting point of the pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes. And the other important thing that is happening is we are beginning to see that type 2 diabetes may not be one single disease, but multiple diseases. There might be many phenotypes of type 2 diabetes, and depending on how you count it, it might be 5, it might be 100. But there are several phenotypes, and it is very possible that some phenotypes are more affected by poor insulin secretion, whereas certain other phenotypes are more affected by high insulin resistance. So we might have these two different
there's many different comorbidities, and some people are prone to some versus others, I'm sure. So maybe that links to different phenotypes of diabetes will lead to different comorbidities too.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. That's again a question that is being studied. Clearly, the research that's gone on for the last 4 years, starting from Finland, where they showed using their biobank that there are 5 different phenotypes of type 2 diabetes, and that's been replicated in several other populations. What is interesting is the distribution of the phenotypes might be different in different populations. Like in India, for example, there might be more thin people with the thin version of type 2 diabetes, whereas in the Pima Indians, you might have more of the obese version of type 2 diabetes. And like you said, the phenotypes might have different complication rates. They may have we might have to think of different ways of diagnosing them. There might be different ways of treating and controlling their glucose. So all of these are very intriguing questions, which is where a lot of our research is currently focused on.
I didn't hear you say much about diet. Is anyone looking at diet and how that leads to diabetes and how it can mitigate it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, when I spoke about loss of change of lifestyle, what I was really alluding to was 2 things. Number one, clearly loss of physical activity. It's a big issue. Populations had been used to being physically active 7-8 hours a day, and suddenly, thanks to mechanization of transportation, mechanization of labor, there's a loss of physical activity, and together with sedentary habits like television watching, sitting before computers, computer games, etc. So that's one aspect. And the second is radical, dramatic changes in diet. Diets in several ways. Number one, the total calorie intakes have gone up in many populations, and the composition of diet is not healthy. For example, diets that are low in fiber tend to have a greater risk for diabetes. Diets that are high in refined carbohydrates tend to have a risk for diabetes. Diets that are very high in saturated fat tend to have, increase the risk of diabetes. Diets that are low in fruits and vegetables increase the risk of diabetes. So we need to think in terms of what's a healthy diet. And it's not just the quantity of diet, which is important, but the quality of diet is also extremely important.
So there's many possible avenues of attack. You have to focus, your research somewhere, or what are you looking most deeply into? Which of these mechanisms, or what is it about type 2 that you're focused on?
At 2 levels. And number one, a lot of our research is focused in terms of how can, one of the great things that has happened in the last 20 years, particularly in countries like America, Europe, etc., is once a person develops diabetes, our ability to control it has improved thanks to research. And we are focused a lot on how do you improve quality of care for people with diabetes. And as a result of that, how can you reduce complication rates? So in other words, we're looking at treatment and complications. And that's been very, very successful. We are clearly demonstrating that it's possible to improve quality of care for people with diabetes. And as a result of that, it's possible to decrease the complication rates and to increase life expectancy in people with diabetes. So a lot of our research is focused on that immediate issue. How do you deliver better care in different settings? In terms of the causes of diabetes and prevention of diabetes, a lot of our focus is shifting more and more towards understanding the role of poor insulin secretion to start with, and perhaps deposition of fat in specific places, such as the liver. We think it's not any fat, it's specifically liver fat or deposition of fat in the liver, which might have a specifically toxic effect. So that's the dyad we are trying to focus on, the combination of poor insulin secretion and hepatic fat deposition, and how various diets or physical activity impact that process. And can we also understand the mechanisms by looking at the combination of genes, epigenetics, and metabolomic profiles, etc. And more importantly, studying the phenotypes using sophisticated methods such as continuous glucose monitoring, clamp studies, etc. So that's where we are looking more granularly at the cause of diabetes from the perspective of poor insulin secretion and hepatic fat deposition.
Well, tell me a little bit more about this poor insulin secretion. How is that measured, or how is that even contemplated? How do you know? I mean, I've heard of insulin resistance, but that would be at the point of uptake in the cell.
Yeah.
But how do you determine secretion?
It's a very difficult, a good question and a difficult thing to measure, but there are different ways of doing it. The gold standard way of doing it might be what we call, a glucose potentiated arginine stimulation test. So it's a number of words. So basically what we do is stimulate insulin secretion by infusing glucose, and then also using arginine, and then you measure. It's a clamp study. So you're both delivering glucose and insulin, and then you're trying to figure out how much of glucose you need to do to achieve homeostasis. And it's a complex way, but it's called a clamp study. That's the gold standard way of doing it. But short of that, there are tests like the IVGTT, an intravenous glucose tolerance test, or even a simple oral glucose tolerance test. There are formulas you can use based on the glucose and insulin levels to calculate potentially calculate insulin secretion. There is a test called the mixed meal challenge test. That's another way, because essentially if a healthy person had a meal, within 10 to 15 minutes, insulin secretion kicks in. It's called the first phase insulin response. And that's the one we are really interested in to measure insulin secretion. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to give people a 75-gram glucose load after an overnight fast and measure their glucose levels at 30 minutes and their insulin levels at 30 minutes. So that gives us an indirect measure of insulin secretion. So the measurement...
Well, quick question here. So I would think the secretion would be in a feedback loop with uptake and usage. So if you've got two people, same insulin secretion, but one has significant resistance, I would think that feedback loop would very quickly tamp down the insulin secretion, or maybe not, I don't know. But it would misinform the secretion part of it.
You're absolutely correct. And that's why it's so difficult to measure, because you don't know how much of that secretion is because of the feedback versus the innate response. And that's why the early part of the response is very important. And that's also why these clamp studies have very complex protocols where we try to control for that. We try to make all other things equal and just try to measure a secretion as an independent effect. So that's you touched on a very important methodological question, and that's why the clamp protocol is extremely difficult. Yeah.
Well, I'm not asking you for diagnosis, but I'm just going to give you like an example. So like my wife and I both wear CGMs. We're both, I guess you consider pre-diabetic.
Yep.
So when I eat a meal, my insulin will go up, but if it's a bad meal, my insulin will go high, and it'll stay high and come down slowly.
Yep.
And hers, it'll spike and then come down like crazy and kind of crash.
Yep.
So we get two completely different profiles.
Yeah.
What, just speculate. Why do you think that would be?
I mean, speculation. I think, one like I said, different phenotypes have different patterns, number one. One possibility is one of you, particularly where the insulin levels goes up very high very soon. That person probably has fairly good insulin secretion, to start with. That may be why the glucose levels are going up, whereas the other person might be more insulin resistant. It's possible. Again, one needs to examine the profile more carefully. So those are some of the subtleties that we have to understand from what happens in a CGM, for example. Yeah.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Yeah, in the CGM, I can see how useful they are. You get all kinds of differences and nuances that you never see. Like, when I go to sleep, I'll see the glucose trend down, and then at a certain time in the morning, it'll come up. Yeah. Sometimes it continues rising, sometimes it doesn't. But does anyone have any insight into some of these patterns?
Definitely. I mean, I think number of things. Number one, the last meal definitely plays a role. So suppose you're going to have a meal very close to bedtime. You're challenging your insulin production at night. So that's one thing to remember. Your meal patterns and your physical activity patterns during the day, particularly during just before you go to bed, may have an influence on that. The second, of course, is what we call a diurnal rhythm. The body's production of steroids is different. And so, there is a rhythm at night where at certain times in the night there is, secretion of steroids, which can have an influence on metabolism. So that's another thing that can happen. And the third is, as body's glucose levels go down a lot during early mornings, there might be a compensatory response, adrenergic response in the body. So it's a very complex neuroendocrine loop that connects all this. So clearly, and the final thing to remember is sleep is a very important thing when it comes to glucose regulation and insulin regulation. Quality sleep and may increase insulin resistance, and also poor duration sleep might also be a problem. So all of these things are extremely important. The issue here is it's a when you think about it evolutionarily, glucose metabolism has been finessed beautifully by nature, because without glucose, our brains won't survive. So it's a very strong adaptive homeostatic mechanism that has been built in place. So any little disturbance to that, the body reacts. So for a long time, one is able to compensate. When that compensation goes whack, that's when disease starts appearing. So all of the things that you notice at night is a combination of a number of factors.
I figured it was. I just wanted some insight into maybe the major drivers of
the major drivers clearly
glucose during the day and night.
Yeah, the major drivers at night really is the food and exercise close to sleeping, your sleep pattern, and also the diurnal steroid responses.
Okay. Well, yeah. What kind of steroids are released and why? I don't want it to be like a side journey away from this, but just
when you look at cortisol productions tend to peak the wee hours of the morning, and why that is the case, there's a lot of reasons for it, but so those kind of things, and then the body is not static when we are sleeping. There are things happening within us.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, definitely. So insulin secretion, even if you find a difference in people, what would you do? Like, how would you modulate that?
A number of reasons.
The person has
Okay, good question. I think firstly, establishing that is important. And secondly, diagnosing those variants might require different types of tests. That's another question. So whether, the standard test, does it pick up those kind of variants? That's a big question that we need to be answering. And thirdly, like you said, the type of therapy might be different. There are therapies that you might target for improving secretion, and there are therapies that you might target for improving insulin resistance. So that order of those therapies might change a lot, depending on the type of diabetes type 2 diabetes you're talking about. And finally, like you earlier mentioned, the prognosis might be different. The type of complications might be different. So knowing the type allows you to look for those things and to mitigate them.
Okay. And then you talked about different phenotypes. What does that mean? What kind of types have been identified or postulated for diabetes?
Okay, a phenotype is basically just is how the disease manifests itself. So, like one of the phenotypes could be type 1 is a phenotype, if you like, and type 2 in a thin person is a certain phenotype, or there might be type 2 in older people, might be another type of phenotype, or there might be type 2 in an obese person would be a fourth phenotype. So there are these different combinations of presentations, if you like.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, those really sound general, though. How do you drill down on those phenotypes and then say, okay, well, we can link that with, they're more likely or predisposed.
Exactly.
Well, a predisposition towards retinopathy or, neuropathy of the foot.
Exactly. I think this is where, suppose you had a large biobank of data on people with diabetes, and you're able to come up with these phenotypes, analyze the phenotypes, and you can prospectively follow them either in the biobank or in prospective studies to see who develops what. That's one way of doing it. That's going forwards. The other thing is the etiology. This is where you might want to collect information on genetics, on epigenetics, which is how the genes express themselves, or on metabolomic markers. I mean, glucose is one measure, but there are various metabolites, which are breakdown products. So you can measure those. So that will give you a greater understanding of the pathophysiology, and give you clues to therapeutic targets, etc.
Oh, but it's still early days, it sounds like, and there's not really, an establishment of this yet.
Yeah, this is the early days. And I think in the next 10 years, 5-10 years, we're going to see a lot of excitement in this area. This is where when we talk of precision medicine, this is exactly, where we are thinking about, where perhaps based on the right combination of information on genes, on other factors, regular glucose and other factors, plus the phenotypical information, maybe treatments will be more customized for different people. Now these treatments are fairly standard, so we might want to more customize them. If one person has more of a secretion problem, well, we treat you with drug A. If somebody has a insulin resistance problem, we might treat you with drug B first, things like that. And like you mentioned, the CGM, your pattern is different from your wife's pattern. So maybe those kind of things will be taken into account as we make things more finer. I think that's where precision medicine is likely to go.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. What about looking at people with diabetes longitudinally, people that have had it for 6 months versus 6 years or 10 years?
Yeah,
is anyone looking there, and what do they see?
Those kind of studies have happened a lot. I mean, clearly we know that the rate of complications increase with duration. Duration is a very powerful indicator of risk for complications, over and above everything else. So those things have been studied. Like we know, after a certain number of years, when the risk for retinopathy begins, when the risk for kidney disease begins. Those kind of data are already available and have been studied. But I think the bigger question is whether somebody who develops type 2 diabetes at a younger age, we're seeing a lot of type 2 diabetes in people less than age 20 or 25, and they have more severe forms of disease, and whether in them complications develop within shorter duration is a big question. And there are some prospective studies happening in that area.
Okay, very interesting. So Venkat, what's the best way for people to learn more about your research? And we didn't talk about the policy side. Actually, before we end, I want to ask you quickly about that. What's important about the policy side of it and the fact that diabetes is exploding around the world?
Okay, I think firstly, 3 or 4 important things. Firstly, when you look at the burden of diabetes worldwide, something like 90% of the cases of diabetes are in low and middle income countries. But when you look at where the research is happening, less than 3-4% of research is happening in low and middle income countries. So there's a mismatch between where the epidemic is and where the research is. So we need more high quality research to understand diabetes in several parts of the world, particularly in the poorer countries of the world that are now economically developing, number one. And secondly, the low-hanging fruit really is the fact that there are excellent treatments available for people with diabetes, for control of blood glucose, for control of blood pressure, for control of lipids, regular testing for eye complications, kidney complications, treating them early. And we know that implementation of that high quality of care has helped people with diabetes in high-income countries and brought down complication rates. We need to do the same through policy in other countries. For example, in the HIV world, they have this thing of 90-90-90. Perhaps we need something similar for diabetes. Why is it even today 50% of people with diabetes are still not detected. So maybe we need a target saying, within the next 10 years, 80% of people with diabetes will be detected, 80% of those who are detected will be treated, and 80% of those who are treated will have diabetes well controlled. So that would be, it would improve diabetes quality of care, number two. And thirdly, in terms of prevention, we have solid evidence that good lifestyle interventions, improving physical activity, improving diet, can reduce the risk of diabetes substantially. And we need ways of implementing that, both at the individual level, through health systems, and also through food and agricultural policy. I think that's where those things need to happen.
Okay, well, very good. Venkat, again, what's the best way for people to follow your research? Because you've got a lot going on, and you have a good overview of all the factors here.
You can go to our website. It's the Emory Global Diabetes Research Center. Emory Global Diabetes Research Center. We have a website, so you can get a lot of the information there. Or you can check me on my PubMed. I'm listed as Narayan, Narayan, KM. So you'll get all my papers there. Those would be two simple ways of tracking the work we do.
Okay, well, very good. Venkat, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.